It's the early 1500s, and I find myself locked away in a dark dungeon beneath the city of Bologna. My hands are tied behind me, and my body is pulled tight against a wooden post. I already know what's coming, and the fear settles in before the pain ever does. It begins with a single sound, a drip. I hear it before I feel anything. Somewhere above me, a tiny drop of water breaks free. There's a brief pause, just a heartbeat of silence, and then it touches down softly on the center of my forehead. At first, I almost laughed to myself. Is that really all there is to it? Just a light tap of cool water on my skin? The sound is faint, the feeling barely noticeable. For a moment, it even flirts with being soothing. But then it happens again. Another soft noise, another droplet forms, and once more it lands in the exact same spot on my forehead. Then another follows, and another, and another. Before long, I realize this isn't some broken pipe or damp ceiling dripping at random. This is deliberate. This is a carefully crafted form of torture, built to tear down my mind and body one slow second at a time. The drops keep coming without mercy. 10, 20, 50. After a while, I stop counting altogether. What once felt harmless turns into something unbearable. Each drop now explodes inside my skull like a gunshot. The noise pounds through my head so loudly it drowns out every thought. All that's left in my mind is that endless, maddening rhythm. Every tiny impact feels like a hammer striking bone, like some enormous bird pecking again and again at my skull. Soon, I'm certain my head is going to collapse from the inside. But somehow, the worst part isn't even the pain. It's the waiting. That tiny delay between the sound of the drip and the moment it hits my skin stretches into an endless gap filled with dread. I shrink against my restraints, trembling as I wait for the next soul-crushing drop to land. I don't know how long I've been here anymore. Minutes blur into hours. Hours might be days. Time itself no longer makes sense. The only thing I truly understand is this: those drops will never stop unless I break and give my torturers exactly what they want. Music. Water is supposed to be life. We need it to survive, plain and simple. Skip drinking for 1 day and you'll feel it fast. Push it to 2 days and your body starts to panic. By the third, death is a real possibility. But we also know the other side of water, the deadly side. Frozen water can steal your heat and kill you with hypothermia. Boiling water can burn you alive. Diseases carried through water, like cholera, have wiped out millions across history. Believe it or not, you can even die from drinking too much water. That's before we even get to something as simple and final as drowning. So yes, water keeps us alive, but it can kill just as easily. And to executioners and torturers throughout history, that deadly balance made water the perfect weapon. From dunking chairs used to test witches to the simulated drownings at Guantanamo Bay, water has shown up again and again as a tool of suffering and control. But what if the goal isn't quick pain? What if the real intention is to stretch someone's suffering out for hours or even days at a time? That's exactly where water torture comes into play. You might hear it called Chinese water torture, but the idea is simple and brutal. Water is dripped over and over onto a prisoner's head until their body and mind finally give out. The question is, how does something that sounds so harmless turn into real torture? And who was twisted enough to dream it up in the first place? To get those answers, I need to take us back several hundred years to the torture chambers of early modern Bologna. And here's the strange truth. There's nothing Chinese about Chinese water torture at all. That name came from a time when Chinese culture seemed mysterious and frightening to Western minds. Slapping the word Chinese onto anything automatically made it feel exotic, foreign, and terrifying. In reality, the first real record of this kind of torture comes straight out of Italy in the early 1500s. That's where a lawyer named Hippolytus de Marsilius enters the story. From everything we know about him, this guy was anything but gentle. By day, he lectured on law and hosted public seminars. But behind closed doors, he took a special interest in inventing new and creative ways to force confessions out of prisoners. Some of the techniques he helped develop stuck around well into the modern age. One of his favorite psychological tricks was repeating the same set of questions over and over again, but with different groups of interrogators. The goal was to confuse and wear down suspects until they contradicted themselves and cracked. Honestly, it's not that far off from the good cop, bad cop routine that's still used today. But Hippolytus didn't stop with mental pressure. He believed pain should be part of the process too, and that's where his methods crossed fully into cruelty. Long, punishing forced marches were common in Bologna's prisons under his influence. Prisoners would be dragged into a hallway and ordered to walk back and forth with no clue how long it would last. What starts as simple walking slowly turns into torture when there's no end in sight. He was also a strong believer in sleep deprivation. Interrogations could drag on for hours while the prisoner was forbidden from sleeping. If they nodded off, they'd be yanked awake or jabbed with a sharp pin to keep them alert. By now, the pattern is pretty clear. Hippolytus specialized in taking ordinary, almost harmless actions and turning them into unbearable torture by stretching them out over time. That mindset leads straight to the method he became most famous for: water torture. According to the story, Hippolytus was once out walking when he noticed a thin stream of water trickling from a natural spring. The drops fell in a steady rhythm, striking the stones below one after another. Each tiny drop made only the slightest mark, but over time, the effect was impossible to ignore. At first glance, the softness of the water didn't stand a chance against the solid, stubborn rock below it. Each drop burst apart the moment it hit, like it never had a chance. But when I looked more closely at what Hippolytus supposedly saw, the real picture came into focus. Sure, a single droplet didn't seem to do anything. But when you watched the steady rhythm of countless drips, falling day after day, week after week, year after year, you could see the stones slowly giving way. Over time, the rock showed a deep groove carved out by nothing more than that patient, repetitive impact. And that's when Hippolytus, being the completely normal and totally not disturbed fellow that he was, had a revelation. If water could wear down something as tough and unyielding as a rock, imagine what the same process could do to something far softer, like a human skull or, even better, a fragile human mind. As far as origin stories go, it fits the tone of Renaissance Italy pretty well. If you've ever read about the torture devices from that era, you know those folks had no shortage of creativity. Between the breathtaking art and architecture, there was plenty of quiet brutality simmering in the background. But here's the catch: unlike some methods we have clear documentation for, like the strappado, we actually don't have any concrete evidence of water torture being carried out during Hippolytus's lifetime. He mentions the idea in his writings, but he never describes a real-world case of it being used on an actual prisoner. So does that mean the whole thing is just a legend? Not necessarily. For one thing, water torture would have been incredibly easy to set up. All you needed was a sturdy pole, a way to tie someone down, and a controlled source of dripping water. Compared to something elaborate like the strappado, this would have been simple and cheap. It's not hard to imagine the authorities in Bologna putting it into practice, even if no one bothered to write it down. And based on what we know from people who have willingly tested it in modern times, the method probably did exactly what it was supposed to: drive a person to the brink without actually killing them. For example, in 2005, the American TV show Mythbusters ran an experiment to see how water torture really works. Both Carrie Byron and Adam Savage tried it out, but under very different conditions. Carrie was strapped down flat while the water dripped onto her forehead. Adam, on the other hand, stayed upright and wasn't tied down at all. Carrie ended up facing both physical and emotional stress. She said the experience made her feel intensely claustrophobic, and her shoulders went into painful spasms. She had to stop just shy of the 2-hour mark. Adam managed a bit better. He lasted over 3 hours and didn't feel as overwhelmed as Carrie. Still, he admitted the whole thing was far from comfortable. Of course, Mythbusters is entertainment first and science second. The experiment definitely wasn't run under strict scientific conditions. There were only 2 people involved, and the setup was more for television than real research. Still, it gave us a pretty clear idea of how water torture actually affects a person. The Mythbusters team came away believing that the restraints were just as important as the dripping water itself. Carrie, who was tied down, suffered far more than Adam, who was free to move. Their theory was that the total lack of escape made the psychological effects much worse. Even so, they had no interest in pushing the test any further, restraints or not. Both of them were shaken by what they'd experienced, and they agreed the torture absolutely worked. For them, that was proof enough. After the episode aired, Adam Savage received a strange email from a viewer. The sender turned out to be a dedicated amateur mythbuster who had been experimenting on their own. Adam later recalled just how unsettling that message was. According to the writer, water torture worked best when the drops were completely random instead of falling in a steady rhythm. The logic was that the human brain naturally locks into patterns and eventually gets used to them. A steady drip over time might even become calming or hypnotic. But when the timing is unpredictable, when you never know when the next drop is coming, that's when the mind really begins to unravel. The email ended with a line that was downright chilling. The writer claimed that using random drips, they had managed to trigger a full psychotic break within just 20 hours. In any other context, that might sound like interesting research, but in the context of torture, it's incredibly disturbing. How did this person even know what a psychotic break looked like? Who were they experimenting on? And what happened to that person afterward? Those are questions with no comforting answers. Adam Savage was already deeply affected by his own experience under the dripping water, but that email clearly unsettled him even more. Years later, in 2025, he openly admitted that the team had been naive to create an episode focused on historical torture. He said, in his own words, that deliberately harming human beings is one of the darkest things there is, and that everyone involved regretted making that episode. He made it clear he'd never want to touch a subject like that again. Still, despite how disturbing the Mythbusters experience turned out to be, others went on to subject themselves to water torture after the episode aired. In 2012, Australian artist Lottie Consalvo staged a piece of performance art based on the method. For 7 straight hours, she lay on a bed in a Sydney art gallery while dark-colored water dripped steadily onto her forehead. The blackened water was meant to symbolize the heavy thoughts of the mind, along with the anxiety and sleeplessness she endured after losing her sister to suicide. And just a few hours into the performance, it became clear the process was already taking a toll. Consalvo's mental state started to fracture under the relentless dripping. She later explained that she began to feel as if her sister, who had passed away, was lying right there beside her on the bed. She believed the steady dripping had pushed her into some kind of temporary psychosis. The whole experience was clearly overwhelming for Lottie, though she mentioned that not every moment felt dark or torturous. Speaking to SBS News, she said, "I went through stages of total discomfort, and then I went to this beautiful place at one stage where the drops were going on my head, really cold, and then falling onto my eye and warming up in there and then dripping down the side of my face like a tear. Felt like I was crying." Her description stuck with me. She talked about each drop echoing through her skull like a boom. And while that lines up with what we know about the psychological weight of water torture, her experience was still performance art, not a clinical test. The emotional pain of losing her sister was already weighing heavily on her, and that likely shaped the way she reacted. Even so, the part where she drifted into a beautiful place throws an unexpected twist into the mix. For her, it wasn't all negative. There were strange, almost comforting moments woven in with the distress. Oddly enough, that hint of calmness actually fits with some of the early historical uses of water dripping, not as torture but as therapy. In 2015, criminologist and sociologist Mary de Young published a study on treatments used in European asylums from the mid-1700s through the 1950s. In her work, the so-called dripping machine wasn't listed as a torture device at all. Instead, it showed up as a medical treatment. According to de Young, the dripping machine was basically a bucket mounted above a patient, usually restrained and often blindfolded, that released a steady drip of cold water onto one spot on their forehead. In the 19th century, French and German asylums used it to treat things like chronic headaches and insomnia, conditions they believed came from blood congestion. The idea was that the gentle, repetitive cold might calm the nerves. But de Young also made it clear that not everyone saw the machine as healing. In some cases, it became torture in everything but name, especially when used for long stretches. At an asylum in Piva, in the old Russian Empire, she found records describing how, The 20 patients who slept on straw-covered floors were daily subjected to the dripping machine more as punishment than therapy. Outside of a few isolated experiments in France and Germany, the whole therapeutic angle seems to have been the exception. In most places, the dripping machine wasn't meant to soothe, it was meant to discipline. And when you look at other examples from the 19th century, the punishing, harmful nature of the practice becomes even harder to ignore. In the United States, for example, water didn't always fall in gentle drips. Sometimes, especially after a prison riot or some other major disturbance, guards would unleash a brutal punishment where they dumped entire buckets or streams of water over a convict's body. There's an old wood engraving from 1869 that shows a prisoner at Sing Sing in New York stripped to the waist, standing there helplessly while a torrent crashes down on him. It's nothing like the slow, maddening rhythm of drip torture. This is a straight-up deluge. Instead of gradually unraveling your mind, this kind of treatment hits you with shock after shock, dropping your body temperature so fast that hypothermia is almost guaranteed. The water pounds so hard and fast it can practically knock the breath out of you. The caption under the engraving goes so far as to claim the prisoner died during the punishment. But since the artist never bothered to include a name or date, we've got no way of confirming whether that's true or just a dramatic flourish meant to stir up the public. Across the ocean, there were other examples, much more secretive and disturbing ones. In Berlin, at a place called Hohenschönhausen, water torture was one of many tools used during the years after Germany was split in 1949. The prison ended up on the East German side and, starting in 1951, was taken over by the Stasi, the State Security Service. The place was a true ghost site. It wasn't on maps, wasn't listed in public records, and sat inside a heavily restricted military zone. You could walk right past the perimeter without ever knowing a prison was there. Everything that happened inside stayed hidden. Because of that secrecy, when crowds stormed various Stasi buildings after the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, this particular prison remained untouched. Nobody could storm a building they didn't even know existed. That bought the East German officials plenty of time they used to shred documents, burn archives, and destroy manuals that described the torture and interrogation methods they had relied on for nearly 4 decades. So the only reason we know anything about the place is because of the people who survived it. And many of those survivors recalled water-dripping torture. Drips falling on their foreheads, hour after hour, day after day, breaking down their sanity the same way Hippolytus once imagined water carving into stone 500 years earlier. Today the prison has been transformed into a museum and memorial, a place that forces people to confront the horrors carried out behind its walls. Several torture devices have been reconstructed, including the dripping mechanism, so visitors can see how simple the setup was, and how devastating it could become. And water wasn't only used in drip form. Former inmates described entire cells being intentionally flooded, leaving them unable to lie down or even crouch to rest. At Botzen prison in Saxony, another Stasi-run facility, the flooding was even more extreme. One prisoner recalled water rising so high in his cell that he had to stand on his tiptoes, stretching his neck and leaning his head back just to keep his nostrils above the surface. That was the only way he could avoid drowning. It wasn't dripping torture, but it showed how endlessly adaptable water is when someone decides to use it as a tool for cruelty. When you put all these stories together, the history of water torture becomes a strange mix of contradiction. On the one hand, there's plenty of evidence that water torture, whether through dripping, flooding, or outright soaking, was used effectively in Renaissance Bologna, then revived in parts of Europe during the 19th and 20th centuries. Modern tests, as unscientific as some of them were, strongly suggest that the method can break down a person's mind and body in frighteningly short order. But on the other hand, there's this odd thread running through history where water drips weren't always meant to hurt. In a handful of French and German asylums, the steady dripping was actually considered a form of therapy. We don't know whether those treatments worked, but it's possible that a short session of rhythmic dripping could soothe the nerves or quiet the mind. Lottie Consalvo, the Australian artist, felt both agony and an unexpected kind of peace. Her performance was emotionally intense, but the dripping may have helped her process some of the grief that weighed on her after her sister died. To me, it all boils down to one idea. Take something harmless, stretch it far beyond its normal limits, and it turns into torment. It's the classic case of the dose making the poison. Think about walking. A calm stroll in the park can do wonders for your mental health. But if someone forces you to march for 15 hours straight and threatens to shoot you if you pause for even 1 second, suddenly that wholesome walk becomes unbearable. And that's exactly how the dripping machine works. In the wrong hands, whether those hands belong to a Renaissance judge in Bologna, an East German interrogator, or a guard at Sing Sing, water stops being water. It becomes something terrifying, something relentless, something that leaves you praying for it to stop. And no matter where or when it's used, one thing always stays the same. Whoever's beneath that drip is going to suffer, and suffer badly.